The sky above Valethara 4 had been wrong all day, and Corporal Elias Venn had been the only one who noticed. He stood at the window of the supply closet they had assigned him to, watching the horizon turn a shade of green that reminded him of something sick, something rotting from the inside out. And he thought about the 200 children sleeping in the rooms behind him, and the storm that was coming 3 weeks too early. Nobody had listened when he mentioned it at the morning briefing, because nobody ever listened to the human. And that was fine with Elias, because he had spent his whole life being underestimated, and he had learned a long time ago that being ignored was not the same thing as being useless. Valethara 4 was a frontier colony, one of dozens scattered across the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, under the Galactic Cooperative Resettlement Initiative, a program designed to prove that 6 very different species could share one world and build something together instead of tearing each other apart the way they had done for centuries. The colony had 300 adults and 200 young, and the young were kept together in a massive compound called the creche, a sprawling building of reinforced walls and soft floors and temperature-controlled rooms designed to house the children of every species under one roof. It was a noble idea and a terrible one at the same time. Elias had been assigned to the creche as a cultural bridge officer, which was the cooperative's way of saying they did not know what else to do with him, and he had accepted the role without complaint because it put him near the children, and children were the one thing in the galaxy he understood. Before he had enlisted in the Frontier Corps, before he had crossed light years to stand on alien soil, Elias Venn had been a kindergarten teacher in a small town on Earth, and he had been very good at it, and he missed it every single day. A thin man, average height, brown skin, dark eyes that sat deep in a face that looked permanently tired, and he carried with him at all times a battered paper book filled with lullabies and fairy tales from Earth, a book so old the pages were soft as cloth, and he kept it in the inner pocket of his jacket the way a soldier might keep a weapon. The creche was run by Matriarch Rovan, a Thuriki, and the Thuriki were the closest thing the galaxy had to lions, if lions stood 7 feet tall and had 4 arms and could produce subsonic roars that shook the ground beneath your feet. Rovan was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, with silver-black fur that rippled like water when she moved, and golden eyes that could pin you in place from across a room. And she had made it very clear from the first day that she considered Elias a waste of space and oxygen. "You are here because the cooperative requires a human representative," she had told him. That he felt in his chest more than he heard with his ears. "But you will stay out of the way. You will not interfere with the children, and you will make yourself useful by organizing the supply closets, which is a task even a human cannot ruin." Elias had nodded and said, "Yes, Matriarch," and gone to organize the supply closets, and he had done it perfectly, and he had also quietly memorized the feeding schedules, sleep cycles, medical needs, and behavioral patterns of every single species young in the building, because that was who he was. The creche held Thyriki cubs that were born with claws and teeth and voices like small thunder, and Vichy larvae that clicked and chittered in swarm patterns and panicked when separated from their clutchmates, and Malgary pups that burrowed into anything soft when they were frightened, and Drath hatchlings that were cold-blooded and fragile and needed precise temperatures to survive, and Pelori kits that were empaths who absorbed the emotions of every living thing around them, and a handful of human children who were loud and messy and resilient in the way only human children could be. 200 young, 6 species, 1 building, and tonight the worst storm in Vialthara's recorded history was about to hit 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Facilitator Joel, the Vichy administrator who ran the colony, had ordered all adults to the outer barriers when the storm warnings escalated, because the barriers were the only things standing between the colony and winds that could strip flesh from bone, and every hand was needed. every hand except the ones left behind in the crèche. Rovan had her 2 junior Thyriki guards, massive young warriors named Keth and Sorath, who followed her every command without question. And there was one Vichy medic named Teal, who was competent, but visibly terrified. And there was Elias. 4 adults for 200 children. Rovan had gathered them in the main corridor as the sky turned from green to black, and the first distant rumbles shook the floor. And she had laid out her plan with military precision: guard rotations, lockdown procedures, emergency protocols. And she had looked at each of them in turn, and when her golden eyes landed on Elias, she had said, "Stay in your supply closet, human, and do not get in the way." And Elias had nodded, and gone to his supply closet, and closed the door, and stood at the window, watching the sky crack open. The first wave hit at sundown. It came not as wind, but as sound, a deep electromagnetic scream that turned the air itself into a vibrating weapon. And the lights in the crèche flickered once, twice, and then the subsonic channels that the Thyriki used to communicate with their young went dead, cut off by the electromagnetic interference like a cord being severed. And in the nursery hall, 4 Thyriki cubs, Rovan's own children, opened their mouths and began to. It was not a sound that human ears were built to process, a frequency that lived somewhere between hearing and feeling, and it hit Elias through the walls of his supply closet like a fist to the sternum, and he grabbed the shelf beside him to keep from falling. The roaring triggered the Droth hatchlings, who began to shriek in high, piercing wails that could shatter glass, and the shrieking triggered the Pelori kits, who were empaths, and could not help but absorb every wave of terror in the room, and reflected back amplified. And the Pelori's crying triggered the Malgori pups, who began digging at the floors in blind panic, claws scraping against metal, and the Vichy larvae erupted into a deafening swarm click that sounded like 1,000 bones breaking at once. 200 children, screaming in 6 different frequencies, and the sound was so loud and so layered that the walls themselves seemed to groan. Elias heard Rovan's dominance roar cut through the chaos, a sound meant to silence her cubs through sheer authority. But it only made the non-Thyriki young scream louder, because to them it was just another predator in a room full of terror. He heard Keth and Sorath trying to physically restrain the cubs, and failing, because frightened Thyriki young were strong enough to throw a grown warrior across a room. He heard Teal's frantic clicking as the Vichy medic tried to reach the larvae and was driven back by the wall of sound. Elias stood in his supply closet with his hand on the shelf and his battered book in his jacket, and he listened to 200 children screaming in the dark, and he thought about what Rovan had told him, that he should stay out of the way, that this was no place for a soft species. And then he opened the door and walked toward the noise. He did not run, and he did not shout, and he did not announce himself, because he had learned a long time ago that when children are afraid, the worst thing you can do is add more noise to the room. He walked calmly down the corridor, his boots steady on the shaking floor, and he pushed open the doors to the main nursery hall, and the sound hit him like a wave, and he let it wash over him, and he did not flinch. 200 children in chaos, bodies thrashing, voices screaming, the air itself thick with terror and sound and heat. Rovan saw him from across the room, and her golden eyes blazed with fury, and she opened her mouth to order him out. But Elias was already walking into the center of the room, and in his hand was the battered paper book, and on his face was an expression that Rovan had never seen on a human before. It was not bravery, and it was not recklessness, and it was not fear. It was the look of a man who had just heard a child cry, and could not physically make himself walk in the other direction. He reached the center of the hall, surrounded on all sides by roaring and shrieking, wailing and clicking, and he sat down on the floor, cross-legged, making himself small and low and unthreatening. And he took a breath, and he opened his mouth. He did not raise his voice above the roaring, or try to compete with the shrieking, or attempt to overpower the swarm clicking that filled the nursery hall like a living thing made of sound. He whispered. It was so quiet that it should have been impossible to hear. A human voice reduced to its softest possible form, barely more than breath shaped into words, and the words were old, older than starships and colonies and the Galactic Cooperative, older than almost anything humans still carried with them. It was a lullaby. He had learned it from his grandmother, who had learned it from hers, a chain of whispered words stretching back through centuries, to a time when humans slept in caves, and the dark outside was full of things with teeth, and the only thing standing between a child and terror was a parent's voice saying without words that everything was going to be all right. The language was Old English, something so ancient that even most humans would not have recognized it, but the words did not matter, because the lullaby was never really about words. It was about frequency. It was about rhythm. It was about the specific thing that happens to the human voice when it drops to a whisper, the way it smooths out and slows down and becomes something almost physical, a vibration that lives in the space between sound and silence. And Elias let that vibration pour out of him the way water pours downhill, effortless and inevitable. The first one to hear him was a Pelori kit. She was small, barely 6 months old, with enormous ears that took up half her head and fur the color of pale moonlight. And she had been crying so hard that her tiny body was shaking, because she was an empath, and the terror of 200 children was flooding through her like electricity, and she could not make it stop. But then something changed. Something new entered the room, something so faint it was almost not there at all, and her ears, those magnificent ears that could detect emotional frequencies across 100 meters, swiveled toward the sound, the way a flower turns toward light. She felt it before she heard it. It was calm. Not the absence of fear, but something deeper, something active and deliberate. A calm that had been built and maintained and practiced over years. The kind of calm that a person holds onto with both hands while everything inside them is screaming. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. The kit stopped crying, and her enormous eyes went wide and wet, and she turned her whole body toward the human sitting on the floor, in the center of the chaos. And she took one wobbling step toward him, and then another, and then she was running on her short, unsteady legs. And she reached him, and pressed herself against his knee, and the vibration of his whisper traveled through his body and into hers, and she closed her eyes. Rovan saw it happen from across the room, and she did not understand. She watched as the Pelori kit curled against the human's leg and went still. And she watched as a second kit followed, and a third, drawn to him like small pale moths to something warm. And within a minute, every Pelori kit in the room had migrated to the human and arranged themselves around his legs in a tight cluster, and stopped crying. Then the Malgori pups. The pups had been digging at the floor in blind panic, their claws leaving gouges in the metal. And when the Pelori stopped crying, the sound level in the room dropped just enough for the pups to hear the whisper. And their burrowing slowed, and their heads came up, and their wide dark eyes found the human, and something in their hindbrain, something ancient and mammalian, and shared across 1,000 worlds, recognized the sound as safe. They crept toward him on their bellies, low and cautious, and they burrowed against his sides, and between his arms and underneath his crossed legs, pressing their warm bodies into every gap and hollow they could find, because to a Malgori pup, safety was a small dark space with something warm and alive inside it. And this human had made himself into exactly that. Elias kept whispering, and he did not move, and he did not open his eyes. The Vichy larvae came next, and that was the one that made Rovan's breath catch because Vichy larvae were insectoid and cold, and operated on swarm logic, and should not have responded to a mammalian vocal frequency at all. But they did. They crawled toward him in a clicking stream, and settled into his lap and across his shoulders, their clicking slowing from panic to something rhythmic that matched the cadence of his whisper, and they went quiet. Rovan pulled the scanner from her wrist and activated it with shaking hands, and aimed it at the human, and what she saw on the readout made her go very still. The scanner measured frequencies, subsonic and sonic and ultrasonic, and it showed her exactly what the human's whisper was doing to the air in the room, and the pattern it displayed was impossible. When a human voice dropped to a whisper, it produced a harmonic resonance pattern, a specific layered vibration that was almost identical to the parental safety frequencies of not one, not two, but 4 of the 6 species in the room. The pylori safety hum, the Malgarai burrow call, the Vichy clutch tone, and Rovan felt her fur rise along her spine, the Thyriki mother rumble, the deep subsonic purr that a Thyriki mother produced when she curled around her cubs to tell them that nothing in the world could reach them. The human was producing it by accident, not by design, not by technology, not by any conscious effort, but by the simple biological fact of what happened to human vocal cords when they whispered, a quirk of evolution that had developed over millions of years on a small blue planet where human parents had soothed their young in the dark, surrounded by predators, where the whisper had been shaped by natural selection into the most calming sound a human body could produce, because the parents who could calm their children quietly survived, and the ones who could not, did not. And by some cosmic coincidence, some impossible accident of convergent evolution across species separated by thousands of light years, that frequency matched. It matched almost everything. The draft hatchlings were the next to respond, and they were the ones that should not have worked at all, because they were reptilian and cold-blooded, and their species had no parental bonding calls whatsoever. But they were drawn to him anyway, not by sound, but by heat, because in his effort to stay calm, Elias's body temperature had risen slightly, a human stress response. And the hatchlings could sense thermal signatures, and they found him and coiled around his ankles and his wrists, and the heat of his body was enough. And they settled and closed their eyes. That left the Thyriki cubs. There were 4 of them, Ravan's own children, and they were the largest and the loudest, each one nearly as big as the human, with claws that could tear metal, and voices that could crack stone. And they were still roaring, still flooding the room with subsonic waves of panic that made Ravan's bones ache. She watched the human sitting in the center of the floor, buried under a pile of sleeping alien children, whispering into the chaos, and she watched her cubs roaring at the walls and the ceiling, and the storm outside, and she knew that if they did not stop, the sound would build until it damaged the smaller children, the larvae and the kits and the hatchlings that were now clustered around the human like he was the last warm thing in the universe. She opened her mouth to issue another dominance roar, and then she stopped, because the closest cub was her youngest, a female named Vreth, who had always been the most sensitive of the litter, had turned her massive head toward the human, and her roaring had faltered. Vreth took one step toward him, and then another, her golden eyes locked on this small strange creature that was making a sound her body recognized even though her mind did not. And she lowered her head and pressed it against his shoulder. And the impact nearly knocked him over, but he did not stop whispering. He did not even open his eyes. And Vreth's roaring dropped to a rumble, and then to a purr, and then to silence. And she slumped against him with a sigh that shook the floor. The other 3 cubs followed their sister within minutes, drawn by the same impossible frequency, and they pressed against the human from all sides, their massive bodies forming a wall of fur and warmth around him. And one by one their roars faded, and their eyes closed, and they slept. The hall fell silent. For the first time in hours, there was no roaring, shrieking, no clicking, no wailing, nothing but the faint sound of breathing from 200 sleeping children, and the barely audible whisper of a single human voice repeating words from a language that had been dead for 1,000 years. Rovan stood at the edge of the nursery hall, and she could not move. She looked at the scanner readout still glowing on her wrist, and she looked at the human sitting cross-legged on the floor, with 200 alien children piled on and around and against him. Cubs that outweighed him draped across his back, larvae settled across his shoulders, kits nestled in the curve of his arms, hatchlings coiled around his ankles, pups burrowed against his sides, and he was still whispering, his eyes still closed, his voice barely louder than breathing. Keth appeared beside her, and he was staring at the same scene, and he said in a low voice, "Matriarch, what is he doing?" Rovan did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "Something. We cannot." The storm raged outside, and the walls shook, and the green lightning tore the sky apart. But inside the nursery hall of the creche on Vaelthara 4, 200 children of 6 species slept in a pile, around a human who would not stop singing them to sleep. And the night grew longer. 3 hours after the children fell asleep, the temperature regulators failed, and Elias knew that the real fight was just beginning. He felt it before the alarms triggered, a subtle shift in the air, a cooling that started at the edges of the room and crept inward like something alive. He opened his eyes for the first time since he had started whispering, and looked down at the draft hatchlings coiled around his ankles, and saw that their scales had gone pale, which meant their body temperature was dropping, which meant they had maybe 40 minutes before hypothermia set in, and maybe 90 minutes before they started dying. He did not panic. He had spent 12 years in a classroom full of 5-year-old human children, and if that experience taught a person anything, it was how to think clearly when everything was falling apart. He looked across the room at Rovan, who was already moving toward the environmental control panel, her 4 hands working the interface with fluid precision, and he could see from the set of her shoulders and the flattened angle of her ears that the news was bad. "The thermal grid is down," Rovan said, her voice low enough that the sleeping cubs did not stir. "The storm has overloaded the backup systems, and I cannot restore them from inside the building. And the communications array is still dead, so I cannot reach the settlement for help." She looked at the draft hatchlings, and Elias saw something in her golden eyes that he recognized because he had seen it in the mirror 1,000 times. The specific terror of an adult who is responsible for children they might not be able to save. "How long do the hatchlings have?" she asked. "Less than an hour at this rate," Elias said, and his voice was hoarse from whispering, but steady. "But I have an idea, and you are not going to like it." Rovan's ears flattened further. "Tell me." "Your cubs," Elias said, "Thyriki run hot. Core body temperature is nearly 45 degrees. And if we arrange them around the hatchlings, the thermal transfer alone could keep the hatchlings alive until we restore power or until the storm breaks." The silence that followed was heavy enough to have its own gravity. Rovan stared at him, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, because what he was asking was for her children, her Thyriki cubs, born of a species that considered themselves apex predators, the ruling class of a dozen star systems, to serve as living blankets for a clutch of draft hatchlings, a species the Thyriki had historically considered beneath their notice. "My cubs are not heating devices," she said, and her voice carried a warning that would have made a lesser person step back. "No," Elias agreed, "they are protectors, and that is exactly what I am asking them to be." He had learned that Rovan did not respect softness, but she respected honesty, and what he was about to say was the most honest thing he had ever told her. "Matriarch, Your cubs are going to wake up in the next hour, whether we move them or not, because the cold will reach them too eventually. And when they wake up scared and disoriented, they are going to roar again, and the whole cycle starts over. But if we move them now, while they are still sleeping, and we put something small and warm and alive against their chests, something they can curl around and protect, their instincts will keep them calm. Because a Thyriki cub that is guarding something smaller than itself does not panic. It settles. It goes still. It becomes exactly what its nature tells it to be. He paused and then added, I read the species manual, the entire thing, all 800 pages, and I remember what it said about Thyriki developmental behavior. That cubs who are given something to protect during their first year show a 40% reduction in aggression-based stress responses. And right now, matriarch, your cubs are drowning in aggression-based stress, and I am offering them a lifeline. Rovan looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, You read the entire manual. Twice, Elias said. Something shifted in her expression, something small and complicated that he could not quite name. And she turned to Keth and Sorath and gave the order. They moved the cubs carefully, one at a time, lifting the massive sleeping bodies with the practiced gentleness of their species, and laying them in a ring around the cluster of Drath hatchlings in the warmest corner of the room. And when the first cub, Vreth, the youngest, felt the cool, smooth body of a hatchling press against her chest, she did exactly what Elias said she would do. She curled around it. Her massive paws came together and formed a cage of warmth and fur, and her breathing deepened, and a low, unconscious purr started in her throat, and the hatchling coiled tighter against her, and its color returned, flushing from pale gray to healthy dark green. And Rovan watched her daughter cradle another species child in her sleep, and protect it without ever waking up. And something inside the matriarch shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. That was the first crisis of the long night, but it was not the last. The second came an hour later, when the feeding schedules collided. Malgary pups needed to eat every 3 hours, or their blood sugar crashed and they went into seizures. And the Vichy larvae needed a specific protein paste at precise intervals, or they became dangerously agitated. And the Pelori kits needed liquid nutrition warmed to exactly 37 degrees, and the human children needed simple solid food and water. And every single one of these requirements was different, and some of them were chemically incompatible, meaning that feeding one species in the same space as another could trigger allergic reactions or toxic exposure. The Vichy medic Teal was overwhelmed, her compound eyes darting between 6 different feeding stations, her mandibles clicking in a pattern that Elias recognized as barely controlled panic. Teal, he said, and she turned to him. I need you to handle the larvae and the kits. Those are the 2 most sensitive groups, and you have the medical training to manage the dosing. Can you do that? She clicked in affirmative. Keth, Sorath, you handle the Thyriki cubs. They eat raw protein, and you know the portions better than anyone. The 2 warriors nodded. Rovan, the Malgorai pups trust you more than they trust me, because your scent is familiar and grounding to mammalian young. Can you handle their feeding station? Rovan's eyes narrowed. And what will you do, human? The Drath hatchlings and the human children, he said. The hatchlings need thermal-regulated nutrient gel, and the human kids need crackers and water, and someone to tell them everything is going to be fine. And I can do both of those things at the same time. He did not give orders, because he was not in charge, and he knew that Rovan would shut him down the moment he overstepped. So instead, he asked questions, and made suggestions, and framed everything as a request. And Rovan recognized what he was doing. She was not foolish, but she allowed it, because his suggestions were correct, and because the children needed to eat, and because there was no time for pride. The feeding rotation took 45 minutes, and not a single cub went hungry, and not a single allergic reaction occurred. And when it was done, Teal looked at Elias with an expression that on a Vichy face was something very close to awe. The third crisis came when the storm surged. It happened 3 times during the night, the electromagnetic waves spiking to levels that made the walls vibrate and the air taste like metal. And each time the cubs began to stir, and the first whimpers of panic rippled through the room like the leading edge of a wave. And each time Elias went back to the center of the floor and sat down and whispered. The first time he was tired. The second time he was exhausted, his voice cracking, his hands trembling against his knees. The third time Rovan watched him stand up from where he had been resting against the wall, and she saw his legs shake, and she saw him grab the doorframe to steady himself, and she saw the dark circles under his eyes, and the grayish tint to his brown skin, and she understood something about humans that she had never understood before. They were not strong the way Thyriki were strong, with muscle and bone and claw. They were strong the way a rope was strong, the way a bridge was strong, the way a thing that held other things together was strong. And they did not break because they refused to, not because they could not. He sat down in the center and he whispered, and the children calmed, and he stayed there long after the surge passed, because the smallest Pelori kit had climbed into his arms and would not let go, and he would not put her down. During a quiet stretch near what Elias guessed was midnight, time had lost all meaning inside the sealed building. The cubs were restless, but not frightened, fidgeting and murmuring in the half-sleep of children who were too tired to wake but too unsettled to rest. Elias pulled the battered book from his jacket and opened it to a story he had read 100 times to human children in a classroom on Earth, a fairy tale about a small brave creature who walked into a dark forest to find its way home. And he began to read aloud in a soft voice, translating the words loosely into Galactic Common. The cubs did not understand every word, but they understood the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of the narrative, the way his voice changed for different characters, the way it dropped low for the scary parts and lifted for the hopeful parts, and they crowded closer, bodies pressing against bodies, species against species, and they listened. Even Rovan moved closer, settling her massive frame against the wall near him, and she told herself it was to monitor the situation, but the truth was that the story was pulling her in, the way good stories pull everyone in, because stories are older than species and older than worlds, and the need to hear them is written into something deeper than DNA. He read for an hour, and when the story ended, the cubs were sleeping again, and the room was warm with their collective breath, and outside the storm screamed, but inside there was only silence, and the smell of fur and scales, and the fading echo of a tale about finding your way home. Near dawn the power failed completely. The last lights died, and the room went perfectly black. Elias kept whispering, because he had nothing else to give them, and he would not give them nothing. Rovan activated the low-light vision that her species used for hunting in the deep dark, and she looked across the nursery hall, and what she saw stopped her heart. Every cub in the creche, all 200 of them, had migrated toward the human, arranged around him in concentric rings, the smallest and most vulnerable, closest to his body, the largest on the outside, facing outward. And the pattern was one she recognized, because it was burned into her species' oldest memories. It was the Thyriki protective sleep circle, the ancient formation her ancestors had used to guard their most precious young, the pattern that said whoever is in the center is the most important thing in the world, and we will die before we let anything reach them. The cubs had done it without thinking, without waking, without any conscious effort. Protect. Rovan stood in the darkness and watched a creature half her size, with no claws and no fangs and no armor, hold 200 children together with nothing but his voice, and she felt something crack inside her chest that she had not known was there. Dawn came to Velthara IV like a wound opening, the sky splitting from black to a bruised orange that bled through the cracks in the creche's sealed windows, and with it came the sound of voices on the other side of the walls, adults shouting in 6 languages, tools grinding against reinforced doors, the frantic, organized chaos of parents who had spent the worst night of their lives on the wrong side of a storm. Rovan heard Facilitator Joel's clicking voice through the emergency channel the moment communications restored. High and fast and barely controlled. Matriarch, report. What is the status of the young? We are breaching the main doors in 2 minutes. All alive, Rovan said, and she heard the silence that followed, the disbelief, because no one on the other side of those doors had expected to hear those words. Not all of them. Not 200 children of 6 species, through a storm that had nearly torn the colony apart. Repeated. All of them, Rovan said again, and she looked across the nursery hall at the human who was still sitting in the center of the floor with children piled around him. And his eyes were closed, but he was not sleeping. She could tell because his lips were still moving, still shaping the whisper that had not stopped since sundown. And his voice was nearly gone, a rasp of breath that barely made a sound. But he had not stopped. He had not stopped once. The doors opened, and the adults poured in, and the scene they found was one that would be described and debated and analyzed across the galaxy for years to come. 200 children sleeping peacefully in a formation that xenobiologists would later call the most extraordinary example of cross-species cooperative behavior ever recorded. Arranged around a single human male who looked like he had not slept in a year and who had to be physically helped to his feet because his legs had gone numb from sitting in same position for 9 hours. The parents found their children unharmed, fed, warm, and calm, and the gratitude that filled the room was so thick you could almost taste it. And amid the reunion of clicking and roaring and purring and crying, Elias slipped away to his supply closet and sat on the floor and closed his eyes, and his hands were shaking so badly he could not hold his book. The aftermath was enormous. Zuel filed an official report to the Galactic Cooperative Headquarters, and within a day, the Xenobiology Division had dispatched a team to Veilthara 4, and within a week, the whisper resonance phenomenon was the most discussed topic in the cooperative scientific community. They ran tests and confirmed everything Rovan's scanner had shown, that the human whisper produced a harmonic pattern that overlapped with the parental safety frequencies of multiple species, a convergent evolutionary coincidence so unlikely it bordered on miraculous. Published papers about it, with titles full of long words and statistical analyses, and the galaxy learned something new about humans. But Rovan did not care about the science. She cared about what she had seen, and what she had seen could not be captured in a research paper, or a scanner readout, or a frequency analysis. She found Elias 3 days after the storm, sitting on a bench outside the creche in the pale Valtharan sunlight, reading his battered book, and she sat down beside him, which was itself remarkable, because Thiriki did not sit beside other species unless they considered them equals. And she said nothing for a long time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through something together, that words could not quite reach. "I must ask you something," Rovan said, finally. Elias closed his book and looked up at her. "All right? Were you afraid?" He did not answer immediately. She appreciated that, because a quick answer would have been a lie, and she would have known it. "I was terrified," he said, "the whole time, from the moment I walked into that room, until the moment the doors opened. I was so scared I could barely breathe." Rovan's ears tilted forward. "You did not look afraid." "No," he said. "How?" He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held the book, that had cradled the Pelori kit, that had trembled in the dark when no one could see them, and he said, "When I was a teacher on Earth, there was a day when a storm hit our school. Not an electromagnetic storm, just wind and rain and lightning. But I had 20 small children in my classroom, and they were scared, and I was scared too, because the building was shaking and the power went out, and one of the children, a little girl named Maya, she looked up at me and said, 'Are you scared too?' He paused, and I realized that if I said yes, every child in that room would fall apart. Because I was the adult, and they needed me to be the wall between them and the fear. And so I smiled, and I said, no, I am right here, and nothing is going to happen to you. And she believed me. And because she believed me, the other children believed me. And because they believed me, they calmed down. And because they calmed down, we got through it. He looked at Rovan. I was lying. I was completely lying. But the lie worked. And after that day, I practiced it every single day of my life. The art of being calm when I was not calm. Of being steady when I was shaking. Of making my voice do the opposite of what my body wanted it to do. You lied to them, Rovan said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only a kind of wonder. Every time, Elias said, humans learn early that children can hear fear in your voice before they can understand the words you are saying. So we learn to lie with our tone, to make our voices say safe when our hearts are saying run. And we get very good at it. Generations of us, centuries of us, and that is why we whisper, matriarch, because a whisper hides the shaking. Rovan sat with that for a long time, turning it over in her mind, the way she would turn over a strategy before battle, examining it from every angle. And why did you walk into the room? She said. I told you to stay in the supply closet. I told you to stay out of the way, and you disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer. Elias almost smiled. With respect, matriarch, you are not my superior officer. You are the head of the creche, and I am the cultural bridge officer, which means I am technically a civilian consultant. So it was not a direct order, it was a strong suggestion. Rovan's ears flattened. That is not an answer. No, he agreed. The answer is that they were children, and they were scared, and I was the only person in the room who had spent his entire life learning how to make scared children feel safe. That is not courage, matriarch. That is not bravery. That is just what I am for. He said it simply, without pride or self-deprecation, the way a person might say they were good at mathematics or bad at swimming, a plain fact about who he was. I could not have done what you did during the storm, he continued. I could not have managed the structural assessments or the security protocols or the tactical decisions you made all night. Those were beyond me. But the children, the scared screaming children, that is the one thing I know how to do. And when I heard them screaming, I could not make myself stay in that closet any more than you could have made yourself abandon your cubs. Rovan looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. My species has a word, Rovan said slowly, a concept that does not translate well into Galactic Common. The word is Krathval, and it means something like the one who stands between the young and the dark. It is the highest honor a Firiki can give to another. Higher than warrior, higher than matriarch, higher than queen. Because it means you are trusted with the thing that matters most. She paused. In 10,000 years of recorded Firiki history, Krathval has never been given to someone outside our species. Not once, not ever. She stood and turned to face him fully. All 7 feet of her, silver-black fur catching the sunlight. 4 hands folded in a gesture he had never seen, and she lowered her massive head until her forehead nearly touched his, and she held it there. And the sound she made was not a roar and not a purr, but something in between, something that resonated in his chest like a second heartbeat. Krathval, she said, Elias Venn, who stands between the young and the dark. Elias did not speak because he could not, because his throat had closed around something too large for words, and he simply bowed his head. Return. And they stayed like that for a long moment, 2 very different creatures who had found in each other something neither had expected. When Rovan returned to the creche that evening, she found her cubs restless again, fidgeting and nipping at each other the way they did when the subsonic channels were still disrupted. And she watched them for a while from the doorway, and then she did something she had never done before. She lay down among them, not standing over them, not issuing a dominance roar, not using the old Thyriki methods of authority and command. She lay down, and she tried to whisper. It did not come naturally to a Thyriki throat, which was built for roaring and rumbling in frequencies that could shake the ground, and the sound she produced was clumsy and rough, more breath than voice, and it did not have the harmonic resonance that made the human version so effective. But her cubs looked up at her in surprise, their golden eyes wide, because their mother had never made this sound before, had never lain down among them like this, had never been this close and this quiet and this soft. Vreth, the youngest, crawled into the curve of Rovan's arm and pressed her small face against her mother's chest and closed her eyes. One by one, the others followed. The sound Rovan made was not a lullaby, and it was not a whisper, and it was not anything the xenobiologists would have found remarkable on their instruments. But it was hers. And her cubs slept. And Rovan kept trying, night after night, her whisper getting a little better each time, a little softer, a little closer to the thing she had heard a human do on the worst night of her life. And she thought about what Elias had said, about lying with your voice, about making the sound say safe, when the feeling said run. And she practiced it the way she had once practiced combat forms, with patience and repetition, and the fierce determination of someone who has discovered something worth being good at. She never told anyone except Elias, and he never told anyone at all. 6 months after the storm, the Galactic Cooperative held an emergency session on Station Aurelis, the massive orbital platform where the representatives of 42 species gathered to argue about borders and trade and the 1,000 small grievances that kept the galaxy from ever truly being at peace. And for the first time in the Cooperative's history, the session was not about war or commerce or territory. It was about children. Facilitator Joel presented the findings from Vialthara 4 to a chamber of delegates who had come expecting another routine frontier report, and instead found themselves watching holographic footage of a single human male sitting on a floor surrounded by 200 sleeping alien young, his voice a whisper that the chamber's audio systems could barely detect, and the room went so quiet that the hum of the station's life support systems sounded like thunder. The xenobiology report was detailed and thorough, and it confirmed what Rovan's scanner had shown on that terrible night, that the human whisper matched the parental safety frequencies of a statistically improbable number of species, that this was not a technology or a technique, but a biological trait shaped by millions of years of evolution, and that it appeared to be effective on nearly every mammalian and several non-mammalian species tested. But the report went further than the whisper. The research team had spent 6 months studying human behavior around non-human young across every colony and station and outpost in the cooperative. And what they found was something that no one had thought to look for before, because it was so ordinary to humans that they did not realize it was extraordinary to everyone else. Humans would comfort any crying child. It did not matter if the child was human, or Thyriki, or Vichy, or Malgorii, or a species they had never encountered before. If a human heard a child in distress, their first instinct was to move toward it, to crouch down, to make themselves small, to speak softly, to offer warmth and presence and the unspoken promise that they would stay until the fear passed. The researchers called it indiscriminate parental empathy, and they wrote about it in clinical terms and quantified it with datasets and statistical models. But what it meant in simple language was that humans could not help themselves. They heard a child cry, and something inside them turned toward it, the way a compass needle turns toward north, automatic and irresistible and as natural as breathing. No other known species did this. Every other species' parental instincts were targeted, specific, limited to their own kind, and usually to their own genetic offspring. and the idea of a Thyriki matriarch comforting a Vichy larva, or a Drath mother warming a Pelori kit, was not just unusual, it was unthinkable, not because they were cruel, but because their biology simply did not prompt them to do. Humans were different. Humans were broken in a way that made them reach for any small thing that was suffering. And that brokenness was perhaps the most useful trait in the galaxy. The vote was unanimous. The Galactic Cooperative formally created a new position to be established in every multi-species colony, station, and outpost in cooperative space. The Creche Warden. It was designated as a human primary role, not because other species were forbidden from filling it, but because humans were the species most naturally suited to it, the species whose entire evolutionary history had been a long, slow lesson in the art of making frightened children feel safe. And the cooperative's charter was amended to include a clause that would become known across the galaxy as the Creche Doctrine. The Creche Doctrine stated that in any multi-species community where the young of more than one species were present, a trained human creche warden would be assigned with full authority over the care, comfort, and protection of all young, answerable only to the community's governing body, and granted a status equal to that of a medical officer or security chief. It was the first time in the cooperative's history that a role had been created specifically for one species, and it was the first time that species was humanity. And the reason was not because humans were the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. It was because they were the gentlest. Elias Venn was named the first official creche warden of Valethara IV, and he accepted the position with the same quiet nod he gave to everything. And when the ceremony was over, and the delegates had gone, and the cameras had stopped recording, he went back to the creche and sat on the floor and read a story to a group of cubs who did not care about his new title. They only cared that he was there, and that his voice was soft, and that when he was in the room, the world felt like a place where nothing bad could happen. He was deeply embarrassed by the attention, and said so to Rovan, who told him that embarrassment was a waste of energy, and that he should focus on doing his job. And then she paused, and added in a lower voice that he was doing it well, which from Rovan was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The years passed. The cubs who had survived that first storm night grew up together in ways that no previous generation of the cooperative had ever managed, because they had shared something on that night that went deeper than politics or treaties or trade agreements. They had been afraid together, and they had been comforted together, and they had slept in a pile around a human who smelled like paper and patience, and that shared experience had woven something between them that could not be unwoven. Thyriki, who had grown up curled around Drath hatchlings, treated those hatchlings as siblings when they were grown, defending them with the same ferocity they showed their own kin. And Malgori, who had burrowed against Pelori kits as pups, remained bonded to those kits as adults, seeking them out in times of stress, the way they had sought the warmth of Elias's body. And Vichy, who had settled into calm against a human's heartbeat, grew into adults who trusted humans in ways their parents never had. The first integrated generation of the cooperative, the diplomats called them, the proof that coexistence was not just possible, but natural, if you started early enough, and if you had someone in the room who knew how to make the fear go away. The creche model spread, first to the neighboring colonies, then to the inner systems, then to the stations and outposts, and eventually to Aurelis itself. And in every one of them, a human warden sat at the center, and did what humans had always done, and what the galaxy was only now beginning to understand was remarkable. They held children who were not their own, and whispered that everything would be all right. 20 years after the storm, Rovan stood in the observation gallery above the Valethara creche, which had grown from a single building into a campus that housed over 1,000 young of 9 species. 3 new species had joined the colony in the intervening years, drawn in part by the reputation of its creche. And she watched the evening routine unfold below her. Elias had retired 2 years earlier, his voice finally giving out after decades of whispering. But he still visited every day, and the cubs still climbed on him, and he still carried the battered book, though the pages were so soft now they were nearly transparent. The new warden was a young woman named Lena Okafor, from a colony on Arcturus, and she had trained under Elias for 3 years, and she had his same quiet steadiness, his same ability to walk into a room full of screaming children and become the calmest thing in it. Rovan watched Lena settle into the rocking chair that Elias had insisted be installed in every creche in the cooperative, a human invention, he had explained, designed specifically for the act of holding a child and moving gently. And Rovan had thought it was absurd until she saw what it did, and then she had ordered 12 of them. 1,000 cubs of 9 species sprawled across the nursery floor, and the lights dimmed, and Lena opened the battered book. The same one passed from Elias to Lena like something holy, like something that mattered more than the paper it was printed on, and she began to read. Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible, a whisper that carried the same ancient frequencies that had saved 200 lives on a night when the sky turned green and the world shook, and the cubs nearest to her settled first, then the ones behind them, then the ones behind them, the calm spreading outward, in ripples the way it always did, the way it had always done since the first human parent whispered to the first human child in a cave in the dark. One by one, they slept. A Thyraki cub, the granddaughter of Reth, Rovan's youngest, yawned hugely and curled around a Drath hatchling that had nestled against her chest, and the hatchling's scales flushed a contented dark green, and they breathed together, and they were warm. A Pelori kit's enormous ears drooped, heavy with sleep, twitching once at some sound only empaths could hear, before going still. A clutch of Vichy larvae clicked softly in unison, a rhythm that matched the cadence of the warden's voice, and then they too went silent. Rovan closed her eyes. She had watched this scene 1,000 times, and it still amazed her. Not the science of it, not the resonance frequencies, or the evolutionary biology, or the papers that the xenobiologists continued to publish in journals she never read. What amazed her was simpler than that. She thought about the first night, about Elias walking into that room, when she had told him to stay out, about the look on his face that she had not been able to name at the time, but that she now knew was the look of someone who had found the thing they were made for. And she thought about what he had said to her in the sunlight, 3 days later. That is just what I am for. Humans had walked into the stars carrying weapons and tools and engines and ambitions, just as every species did, just as the Thyraki had carried their strength, and the Vichy had carried their logic, and the Drath had carried their resilience. And each species had believed that the thing they carried was the most important thing, the thing that would define their place among the stars. But the humans had also carried lullabies. They had carried stories, and whispers, and the memory of sitting in the dark with a frightened child and choosing to stay. And they had carried the strange and beautiful instinct to reach for any small thing that was crying, and hold it and lie to it with their voices, saying safe when they meant scared, saying everything will be all right when they meant I do not know if it will, but I am here, I am here, I am here. They had carried the rocking chair, and the battered book, and the willingness to sit on a cold floor for 9 hours, and whisper until their voice broke, because there were children in the room, and the children were scared, and that was enough. That was the only reason they needed. And that, Rovan thought, as the last cub's eyes fluttered closed, and the nursery went quiet, and the warden's whisper faded into the gentle creak of the rocking chair, that had made all the difference. Outside the windows of the creche, the stars of Vealthera's sky burned in their ancient patterns, indifferent and vast, and somewhere among them, the small blue planet called Earth turned on its axis, carrying its oceans and its mountains, and its billions of people who did not know that the simplest thing they did, the thing they did every night, in every home, in every country, the bending down and the soft voice, and the murmured promise that morning would come, was the thing the galaxy needed most. The night was quiet. The cubs were sleeping. And somewhere in the building, an old man with a hoarse voice and a battered book sat in a rocking chair he had carved himself, and whispered a lullaby to no one in particular, just to keep the sound in the air, just to keep the habit alive, just in case someone, somewhere, needed to hear it. And they always did.